this is America, and that is the port of Baltimore, where the financial effects of the conflict between the US and Iran are certainly washing up on American shores. There might not be active conflict at the moment between the two countries, but with the Strait of Hormuz closed, there's certainly an economic effect being felt, not least in the added cost of shipping. I will have more on that from here in a moment, but first, let's go to Cyril Vanier in our Washington, D.C. studio.
Richard Gaisford, thank you very much. We're 2 months into the U.S.'s conflict with Iran, and there is no winner. Despite overwhelming American and Israeli firepower, the Iranian government did not collapse, people did not rise up, and negotiators didn't give away what's left of the country's nuclear assets. So Iran has not lost, but neither has the U.S. This is a show about what happens when you don't win on the battlefield. What then? The U.S. and Iran are both now selectively blocking the Strait of Hormuz, raising the economic cost of this war for everyone in the hope that the other side will suffer more and will suffer first. That's a strategy based on time. And notice that Donald Trump is no longer promising a swift victory.
I don't want to rush it. I want to take my time. We have plenty of time. And I want to get a great deal. So we were in Vietnam like for 18 years. We were in Iraq for many, many years. We're in for all the, I don't like to say World War II because that was a biggie, but we were 4.5, almost 5 years in World War II. We were in the Korean War for 7 years. I've been doing this for 6 weeks. And the military is totally defeated.
Here's where things stand now. There have been no major attacks carried out since the ceasefire was agreed on April 8th, though violations were reported early on. Since then, there has been an uneasy calm in the region, and a third U.S. aircraft carrier arrived a few days ago, carrying thousands of troops. On top of that, there's the naval standoff in the Strait of Hormuz. It is hard to get a good number for how much that is costing the global economy, but some reports suggest it is north of $1 billion a day. Diplomatic talks between the U.S. and Iran are effectively in a stalemate, with no visible progress since that first round of talks more than 2 weeks ago. The U.S. says that's because Iran wouldn't budge on its demand to never build a nuclear weapon. Iran says it won't commit to further talks until the U.S. lifts its naval blockade, which Trump says is costing Tehran $500 million a day. So that's a high cost to Iran, but the U.S. is also feeling the brunt of this. To explain Donald Trump's gamble, our chief U.S. correspondent, Alan Fisher, is at the White House. Alan, does the president now think that he can outlast Iran?
Well, Donald Trump already thinks he's won the war. He's said it on several occasions. They've destroyed the Air Force, they've destroyed the Navy, they have virtual air superiority over Iran. What's happening now is a negotiation on a deal. Remember, that whole military action was Operation Epic Fury. What they've now launched is Operation Economic Fury. Donald Trump believes that the blockade is forcing Iran to consider the American proposals to end the war. He thinks it's putting pressure on them, and every day he believes that that pressure is getting greater. But it's also putting pressure on around the world. Now, he says that Iran has no cards left to play, so he's willing to sit for as long as it takes to get the deal that he believes is the best for the United States. You remember right at the start of this war, he said that this war would last somewhere in the region of 4 to 6 weeks. That was an arbitrary timeline. He was told that there would be very little fight back from the Iranians. Their defiance, their defence has perhaps shocked him more than anyone else in the cabinet. There were those who said this could be difficult. This could be a long war. You don't want to get involved in this. But Donald Trump believed this was the right thing to do for the American people and for the war. Now he believes that he can wait. He can wait till he gets the deal. He thinks it will force the Iranians to the table. Will it? Well, he's got the confidence that he's going to carry this on as long as it needs, and America will pay the price that it has to pay for a nuclear-free Iran.
Al Jazeera's chief U.S. correspondent, Alan Fisher, thank you very much. And while Donald Trump says that the U.S. has plenty of time to get a great deal, the knock-on effects of the conflict are taking their toll on the American public. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz doesn't only affect oil prices, it also has wider impact on food, manufacturing, and inflation. Richard Gaisford reports from the Port of Baltimore.
Well, the Strait of Hormuz might be thousands of miles away, but the economic ripples of this conflict are certainly being felt here, and the current is getting stronger. At first, of course, everyone was focused on the oil price, the dramatic effect that was having on the price of diesel and petrol. Now, though, other things are starting to be more apparent, including the price of shipping. Now, the cost of getting goods into the United States has definitely gone up. That is going to make imports more expensive, and it is just one effect that is being noticed that is working its way into the system. It's a worrying outlook for American farmers. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz has created a global shortage of fertiliser, and that's been pushing prices up. Nearly 70% of farmers in the US say they now can't afford to grow all of their crops this year. That's likely to mean a reduction in food supply, which could further drive up supermarket prices and inflation. A cut in supply of fossil fuels has meant fewer raw materials headed to Asia for creating plastics for packaging and clothes. That's also pushing prices up, the worst effects still to be felt across America. The president, though, remains optimistic.
Don't forget, we're having some fake inflation because of the fuel. And we have this. A lot of people thought that inflation would be through the roof and the stock market would crash. Well, we just hit an all-time new stock market.
In Iran, the oil industry is being choked. It's the cornerstone of the country's entire economy. And that's taking its toll on government revenues in Tehran. Food prices are also up across the country. The threat of bombing might be on hold, but there's now an economic war to endure. Although, after years of sanctions, Iranians are well practiced at surviving the squeeze. Richard Gaisford, Al Jazeera, Baltimore.
Well, we're joined now by former Special Envoy for Middle East Peace and former U.S. Ambassador David Hale, and former Pentagon official and senior advisor with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Mark Cancian. Mark Cancian, is this now a waiting game between the U.S. and Iran?
Well, that's where we are right now. Certainly both sides believe that they can outlast the other. They're making statements to that effect. But I believe the administration is likely considering military options. They don't know how long this might go on. They have two options on the table. They could launch an operation to clear the strait, or they could relaunch the bombing campaign. They've talked about both.
You think either of those would yield a significantly different result from what we've seen so far?
If they're able to clear the strait, that might bring a different result, because then if shipping could actually get through, the United States would have the upper hand. Redoing the bombing doesn't look like it would have much of an effect. The president has threatened a major escalation there, attacking power plants, for example. Not clear he would do that.
Ambassador Hale, so the economic pain, and we've just described it, is setting in for the U.S. It has already set in for Iran. Is it possible to predict who has a higher pain tolerance for this?
Well, my own guess is that America has a higher level of pain tolerance than Iran under these circumstances, although clearly the Iranian Revolutionary Guards are calling the shots. They have the power in Iran, and they're less susceptible to public opinion than the civilians, who are trying to take a more pragmatic line up until recently. So we will see. But I think if you listen to people who are actually conversant with the economic and financial realities in Iran, they would say that this is a matter of weeks before the Iranians are in a situation where they can no longer sustain the need to pay their people.
That's what the U.S. president seems to believe. He says they're losing $500 million a day, or rather they're not bringing in that money, which is normally what they'd bring in from selling their oil.
That's right. I mean, that's I think, the strategy here. I think it's got a good chance of success, except the fact that we know that the Iranian IRCG and the security establishment are highly resilient and not particularly sensitive to public opinion. So it could be a longer game than just a matter of weeks.
So, Mark Cancian, on this issue of time and who it benefits, in the early stages of the war, Iran appeared to believe the time was on its side. And then Donald Trump, when he launched the U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports, appeared to believe on his end that he had somehow flipped the script and that time was now working to the advantage of the U.S. What would you say?
Well, it's hard to say. First, because President Trump, like the Iranians, is posturing for negotiations. So, of course, he's saying that he has all the time in the world and he has all the cards. But it is true that the United States has more options because the United States has a preponderance of military capability and a much larger economy. It has options the way that the Iranians don't. So it's going to make some decisions and drive this process forward one way or the other.
So right now, neither side has won, neither side has lost. If this continues, Ambassador Hale, no victory or defeat on either side, doesn't that mean, just from a purely logical standpoint, that this can keep going for a very long time?
Yeah, I mean, my own guess is that we're going to see a period of on and off again diplomatic initiatives and talks. We're going to see a period of on again, off again military activity on both sides. And hopefully we'll see an American persistence in putting pressure on Iran. We're going to see other countries who are more susceptible to the closure of the straits perhaps get more active right now. They're in hypercritical mode. Maybe they will move into diplomatic helpful mode and possibly...
Sorry, critical of who?
Critical of the United States.
So you're talking about the Gulf states primarily who are suffering from this blockade?
Europe. The Gulf states are largely aligned with the United States right now. But the consumers are hypercritical, but they're not offering ideas of their own. And I think you'll start to see more initiatives on their part, which may or may not be helpful, including ones to play a role themselves in opening up the straits, as we've seen from the British proposal.
Now, the U.S. president believes that Iran's oil infrastructure is a particular point of weakness for Tehran. Here's him speaking to Fox News on Sunday.
When you have, lines of vast amounts of oil pouring through your system, if for any reason that line is closed because you can't continue to put it into containers or ships, which has happened to them, they have no ships because of the blockade. What happens is that line explodes from within, both mechanically and in the earth. Something happens where it just explodes. And they say they only have about 3 days left before that happens.
Mark Kansian, you were at the Pentagon formerly. Is this the kind of thing that has been war-gamed? Donald Trump appears to believe that if Iran does not get its oil out to market, then at some point Iran's oil reserves are full, and that damages Iran's oil infrastructure beyond repair.
I have heard that, and I think many experts have made that point. It's very hard to tell, and I'll leave that to the petroleum engineers. Okay. But this is a problem that the U.S. military has been thinking about for literally 45 years, ever since the tanker wars of the 1980s. We've war-gamed these kinds of crises. What happens if the strait is closed? What happens if Iran becomes aggressive? When I was a junior officer in the Marine Corps, we practiced some of these amphibious operations. So this is something we've thought about for a long time. And as a result, it's a bit surprising that the United States has not been able to open the strait, given how much time it's had to think about this.
But so that's my question, is because this has been war-gamed, when you hear the president saying, well, just give it a few days and Iran's oil infrastructure is going to sort of start disintegrating, is that based on U.S. intelligence, you think, or U.S. actual planning?
Well, I'm sure he's getting input from petroleum engineers who tell him about the state of the Iranian oil industry. And I've heard from credible sources that, if the oil doesn't flow, then the pressure on the system will cause severe damage. But there's still the problem about opening the strait and whether the United States has the ability to do that if Iran doesn't cooperate. Which
so far the U.S. hasn't been able to do in spite of a U.S. naval blockade. Ambassador Hale, so there will be two clocks ticking on Iran if we just follow the U.S. president's statements. One is the economic clock, the money that they're not making, those $500 million a day by not selling their oil, and the other one is on this impending grave damage to their oil infrastructure. Do those two strategies, which seem to be the pillars of the president's strategy right now, does that seem like a sound strategy?
Well, I think it's impossible to predict. We've never been in this situation. We will see. Certainly, objectively, it would appear to be the case that if we have sufficient patience, that would work. Iran is different.
What gives you that impression?
Well, you yourself outlined the reality.
But I don't know if it's true. But we don't know if it's true.
We don't.
There's no proof of concept.
So give me a moment. I think while we are doing that, undoubtedly you also have mounting U.S. military presence in the Gulf. I think the hesitance to use them is because it will entail deploying them on the ground in places and a higher risk of loss of life. So I think the president would prefer, is my guess, diplomacy and economic pressure to bring results. But he has another option, which hopefully will be something that sobers up Iranian decision makers to see it isn't just about their economy. It isn't just about diplomacy. There is also still an American military option that could change the equation. Because a premise of a lot of the media conversations right now is, and you yourself said it, is that neither side's won or lost. Well, we've decimated their military capabilities. They are no longer, they are completely neutralized in their ability to project power anywhere except what geography gave them, which is the Strait of Hormuz.
They can launch drones and missiles.
Yeah. Well, when was the last strike?
Well,
Okay.
so just before this, right up until, so I live in Doha when the ceasefire was announced, that's when the last strike was.
Yeah, and you've seen a consolidation of power and alliance among the Gulf states with us, because they now see the menace that truly is Iran. No one can be fooled by that. So I think Iran has had a strategically significant setback. Victory and loss may be the wrong words, but they are no longer able to dominate the Middle East the way they were before 2023. We have a problem, the Straits of Hormuz. It will be solved. Then the question is, what would the rest of this negotiation look like? Because even if we get into talks with Iran, the gaps between the two of us are very great, and I don't see how we're going to come to a conclusion on that. So this is not going to end. Even if the straits are resolved in a matter of weeks, we still have a bigger problem, which is the negotiation.
So we did ask ourselves, since we outlined the economic cost, how much it costs for the U.S. to keep its force deployment as it currently is, to maintain this military posture. There's not much clarity on how much this has cost the U.S. taxpayer so far. Here's John Holman.
The bombs have stopped falling, the missiles have stopped flying, but US forces are still in what the military calls the theatre of war. So the million or billion dollar question, how much is this costing, even with a ceasefire on? Simple answer, who knows? Because the man who you might expect to answer, the White House budget controller Russ Vought, isn't telling.
You have no idea, none, how much has been spent on the war so far?
We don't have that figures right now. I think in part because it's fluctuating on a day in, day out basis.
So we've been digging around and we've got a couple of estimates for you. Thinking about what's still there in the zone. 3 US carrier strike groups for a start, the Lincoln, the Bush and Ford, each one made up of an aircraft carrier plus around 70 jets and helicopters, 3 to 5 warships, maybe a submarine. Experts say it costs around $9 million a day to keep each strike group running. That's $27 million altogether. Then there's somewhere between 50 to 60,000 service members still in place during the ceasefire, up from a baseline of around 34,000. Here's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on what it took to keep them fed and awake in the run-up to the ceasefire.
Along the way, we consumed more than 6 million meals, and by my estimate, more than 950,000 gallons of coffee, 2 million energy drinks, and a lot of nicotine, but I am not saying that we have a problem.
All in all, we think their continued presence is costing about $750,000 a day just in food allowances. Back of the napkin maths. But to be honest, all of this is just pocket change. Missiles, drones, bombs, that's the big cost. Just in the first 100 hours of the war, the US shot off an estimated $3.1 billion. President Trump's administration must be thankful it's not doing that now. But aside from the huge cost of replenishing those weapons, there's the problem of a superpower suddenly a little bit low on ammo. The Center for Strategic and International Studies estimates that the US may have used over half of its pre-war stock of 4 key munitions, and that replenishing them could take from 1 to 4 years. So if there's a beef with, say, China or Russia in the near future, that could be a problem. The Pentagon says there's no shortage of weapons, but you can bet that America's friends and foes are watching closely.
So Mark Kansian, war funding and U.S. ammunition stocks, those are parts of your areas of expertise. From a military standpoint, do you think the Pentagon is looking at the clock nervously?
They are. The inventories make the war planners quite nervous. Going into the conflict, they believe that our inventories were not adequate for a war with China. Those inventories are lower now. It'll take 1 to 4 years to replenish them back to where we were, and a couple of years after that to get to where they want to be. So there's a window of vulnerability here. We do have some munitions that are plentiful, so it's not that will be down to throwing rocks at an adversary, but they are not the preferred munitions. There's more risk to the platform. So there is some risk here for a number of years until we can rebuild those inventories.
Ambassador Hale, does this kind of thing, how much the munition stocks have been depleted, how much this costs to keep the carriers in the region, et cetera, does that ever impact policy in your experience?
Well, obviously, our technical capacity, our logistics capacity is a key element. I think perhaps it's important to not necessarily assume that production levels are going to stay where they are now. We can ramp up. We saw that in previous wars. So, I don't lose sleep over it. And personally, I think that the more important thing is the demonstration of American power. And if I were a ruler in China, I would be watching this with two things in mind. One is America's serious. America's a serious adversary. And not only against a country that is in a defensive position, but if China were to take an offensive role against Taiwan, how can they really calculate that what they've just watched over these 6 weeks is something they can handle? The second point is that if I were also sitting in China, I would be concerned about the stability of their own economic dependence upon the Persian Gulf. Pakistan is one of China's closest friends, or maybe the other way around. China is Pakistan's closest friend. Pakistan would not be offering mediation without a green light from China. China wants stability in this situation. So as the president and Xi meet next month, I think it'll be very intriguing to see what they come up with in terms of a more geostrategic position that may be more aligned than people realize right now.
Since you mentioned China, Mark Hansen, there's been speculation that as the U.S. has moved military assets, whether it's missiles, troops, aircraft carriers to the Middle East, it has left other parts of the globe relatively underserved from a military standpoint, especially in Asia. Is that something you're watching?
Well, it is. We've moved a lot of our naval forces out of the Western Pacific to the Middle East, and then we've depleted many of our munitions. Now, when the war ends, those forces will go back to the Western Pacific, so that's a short-term risk. The munitions are longer term, but it is important to note what the ambassador said, which is the United States has shown what its military can do, both here and in Venezuela, for example. China does not have any recent military experience. Their last conflict was in 1979, and they did very badly. They have to be looking at this and wondering whether the U.S. military might be more formidable than they had originally thought. Also, the Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed. They're looking at the Strait of Taiwan and thinking that maybe the Taiwanese might be able to do the same thing the Iranians have been able to do. And then we have a president who has shown that he is willing in some circumstances to use military force quite aggressively. So put together, there are some things that might encourage them to be aggressive, but there are some things that would discourage them.
Ambassador, if we bring it back to Iran and the Middle East, you were a former Middle East peace envoy. If you were called upon to advise this White House in this moment and in this conflict, what would be your advice?
Persistence. The biggest problem for American foreign policy in the Middle East is that we are not persistent in our strategies. Whatever it is, whether it's trying to extend olive branches or whether it's to put maximum pressure on a country, our political system as a democracy often means that decisions are dropped, policies are dropped in 2 to 4 years. So we have to stick to it. The Iranians have understood that. They've seen 8 presidents come and go, more than 8 policies toward Iran come and go. We should stick to this, and this president, whether you agree with his approach or not, should be given enough latitude to see if he can succeed.
All right. Ambassador David Hale, former special envoy for Middle East peace, also a former U.S. ambassador. You held many diplomatic posts in positions really across the Gulf, the Middle East, and the wider region. And Mark Hansen, former Pentagon official, senior advisor with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you very much to both of you gentlemen for joining us in the studio today.
Thanks so much.
And this deadlock between the U.S. and Iran and the question of what happens next that we've been examining has been at the center of the online debate as well. The conversation fueled by social media takes from senior figures within the Trump administration. Here's Alex Baird.
That deadlock now being labelled by some as a new Cold War. Geopolitics podcast, The Duran, saying this is a strategic stalemate. The US entrenched, Iran holding the line, and a double blockade. Trump ally Senator Lindsey Graham warning the president not to believe any offer coming from the Iranians. Stick to your guns. Secretary of State Marco Rubio dragging Tehran for holding the world's energy hostage at Hormuz.
The Straits is basically the equivalent of an economic nuclear weapon that they're trying to use against the world, and they're bragging about it.
But Senate Republicans believe the US side of the blockade is weakening the Ayatollahs by the day, and they're pressuring Iran to comply and agree to the president's terms. The Treasury Secretary taking a harder line, saying Iran's leaders are trapped like drowning rats in a sewage pipe. Besant confident that the US blockade is about to lead to the collapse of the Iranian oil industry.
We need to decide. This can't wait.
And another day, another Iranian Lego video. This time, Trump falling asleep at the wheel, dreaming of victory. New Jersey Governor Chris Christie was once a close friend of Trump, now accusing the president of being trapped in a geopolitical failure of enormous proportions. And that
he's playing checkers, not chess.
This latest Truth Social post that Iran is collapsing, translated now by some here as help, I'm stuck, and now I'm panicking.
Alex Baird, thank you very much. And that's all from the team for today from our Washington, D.C. studio, looking at what this stalemate is currently costing both the U.S. and Iran. Before we hand back to Al Jazeera's global headquarters in Doha, Richard Gaisford previews our next edition of This is America.
Well, thanks, Cyril. In the next edition of This is America, we'll be looking at Donald Trump's handling of the economy and the historic lows he's hit in the approval ratings for it. Does the president care? And will his policies have an impact on the midterm elections? That's tomorrow at 18:30, 2:30 p.m. here, Eastern Time. For now, goodbye.